Welcome back to Hand Sewing with the HTA. In this episode I'm going to demonstrate the felling stitch. So I've taken over this sample from a previous demonstration where we based it with fullness. Now we're going to fell the lining to the cloth. Typically what you do is you match the colour of thread to the colour of the lining on top, or the colour to the cloth on top. For the sake of this demonstration I'm going to use a blue coloured thread to help highlight the stitches and how they're formed. So what you start off by doing is you want to poke your needle in underneath with a knot on it. Knot on the thread, and just get it right out into the edge of the cloth there, like so. And that knot should be strong enough to hold it. Try to get into a comfortable position. Sit down for this. And then what you do is, the thread is out on the top layer, so you come into where behind the thread in the bottom layer, pick up 1/8 of an inch of the cloth and the edge of the lining, and you draw it out. Like so. That. And again, come in just behind where the stitch came out of the top layer, pick up about 1/8 and then draw it closed. Now, what you're also doing here, because you've got fullness in the edge, is you're distributing that fullness, you're pushing that fullness into the stitches. But the stitches itself needs the fullness to close, so it'll also help pull the stitch in, pull the fullness in. Like that. Typically, whenever you're doing this stitch, you'll actually have another layer of canvas or something behind it, and then the front of the coat. We're just demonstrating it onto 2 layers here. You just want to stitch these 2 layers together. It's a lot like the other stitch we showed at the padding stitch, where you've got 3 layers but you only want to sew 2. This stitch is very similar to that, as in you always find yourself in that circumstance where there's not just the 2 layers you're sewing, there's other layers as well. So the closer you can get that stitch to the edge, the smaller it'll be. Now, common mistakes are people doing stuff like this, taking a deeper stitch, so going further into the edge. And then end up with this big stitch on the edge of that. Let's stick out a few more of those so you can see the difference. You end up with that. You end up with a much bigger stitch rather than these small stitches you have up here. You've got a much more noticeable stitch. Another common mistake is this. For a felling stitch. Of course, what you're doing is you're putting fewer stitches over a bigger gap. Even if you were to do the same stitch close to the edge, still doesn't look as neat. What you're trying to do is you're trying to make the stitch invisible as possible. So what you're doing is you're getting it behind where the thread came out, getting it right up onto the very edge of the lining, and then closing it so the stitch straightens up. And if you do it well enough, even with the blue thread, it should become almost invisible. Now, ordinarily I'd be using the tip of my forefinger underneath, but actually I'm not. I'm actually using the very side of it here, so the stitch is actually making contact with it. I'm holding it across the seam this way. I'm not trying to use the point of it, I'm just using the side of my finger. The thumb is still there to guide the needle up, needle through. And the thumb is also there, it's also help easing in that fullness. So I'm pushing ever so slightly forward for each stitch. It's one of those things, when you do it for long enough, you don't even know you're doing it. So getting that right on the, trying to get on the very edge. And you keep the stitches small as well, keep them short, close together. Now, there's a lot of felling stitches in the coat and in the waistcoat. After you've made a couple, you should be fairly skilled putting in your felling stitches. Next to the basting stitch, I'd say the felling stitch is probably the most used stitch in garment making, whether it's trousers or waistcoats or coats. There's a lot of felling to be done in both. All the finishing is, for the most part, is felling. There you go, and I can see the difference there from we start off the small stitch here, and then we started taking more out of the edge, and we started doing it as a, it's kind of like as an angle stitch. And then as you get down into here, like this is like really, this is night and neat. Imagine if that was the same colour there, you'd hardly notice that stitch at all, you know. And then, like, you know, to tie it off, you know, you can lift back the generally what I do is you can lift it underneath. In some place you can lift it and tie it in under there. But if you can't do that, there's nowhere to go. Just turn it around and come back a few stitches. Stitches like that, and then just hide the needle under the line. You want to come down at least a ½ an inch or more. That, and then thread through, and then what you do is you cut the thread off, it pops in underneath, so you've actually left a long piece of thread underneath, so it's not gonna, when this gets pulled out, it's not gonna come undone. Alright, so that's the felling stitch. Thank you for watching.